Happy Halloween! You've reached the Spooky Signal Watch, your haunt for movies, television, comics, and morgues. I'm your ghost, Ryan Steens. Join me and a crypt full of co-contributors as we exhume cultural artifacts of the 20th century, boldly explode the 21st, and try to put it all in perspective. Stay terrified. We're gonna try to make this horrifying.
This hour's top news story. An informant led officers of the Muerto County Sheriff's Department to a cemetery just outside the small rural Texas community of Newt early this morning. Officers there discovered what appeared to be a grisly work of art.
Happy Halloween, and welcome back to the Signal Watch. As always, I'm your spooktacular host, Ryan Steens, and with me today is my ghoulish co-host. Introduce yourself, ghoul.
I shall. It's Justin Chainsaw Lincoln.
Thank you so much for joining us. I was delighted with your selection. You finally got me off my duff to actually watch this movie here at age 48.
Wait, you've never seen it before now?
Not one. I've seen the final shot of it before because it's so famous.
Yes.
And I've seen, I don't know, maybe 20 seconds of it before.
Okay.
And I was vaguely aware of some components of it that I thought were in the sequel, not in this one. And yeah, I don't know anything about Texas Chainsaw Massacre before Friday evening. It's now Sunday. Nice. So now I'm now know more about Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Yeah. So
was it a surprise to hear John Larroquette narrating the opening? Did you expect Marky Post to show up in here somewhere? These are Night Court references for the younger people.
I always get disappointed if Marky Post doesn't show up.
That's true.
So, yeah. I'm always like, ooh, when does Marky pop up? So I had avoided this movie because as a child, I was like, well, that's just going to be people getting carved up with a chainsaw for 90 minutes. Why on earth would I want to watch that? And that's not really what this is.
No. One of the things that I love about this movie is that even though I've seen it a good number of times, I feel like every time I go into it, I'm always expecting that. Even though I know that is not a guy running around with a chainsaw cutting up people. And I'm always pleasantly surprised with the movie that I get, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Having had only seen it once now, it's so. I did not realize how foundational this movie was. That's we said, you have an in for the movie or whatever before we started recording. And I was like, yeah, I do, and I'm going to express it as quickly as I can. And that's kind of where I'm coming at this movie from. Like, it sets the table, borrowing some things from the past, borrowing some things from reality. And I did not realize, I thought The Hills Have Eyes was the thing that set the table for this kind of movie.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize Texas Chainsaw Massacre did that.
And that's one that I've never seen that or any of the remakes for whatever reason. But I guess so. It sounds like it comes after.
It's 77 and this is 74.
Okay. Yeah. Then plenty of time for.
Yeah. So my assumption is this made the rounds and Wes Craven watched it and said, oh, we can one up that.
Right.
And I don't know if he one upped it. He does something different, but that one's a family that drives their RV into the hills runs out of gas or whatever, and now has to deal with a bunch of cannibalistic lunatics living in the hills. So you
Excellent.
can
Not to be
probably
confused.
see why I had that impression.
Yes, yes, but not to be confused with cannibalistic humanoid underground dwellers.
Very different.
Very different.
Chuds. Um, but yeah, this one was filmed around where we grew up, which
Right.
was weird.
Mhm.
You still live in that general area. I just live 10 miles south. I make it sound like I moved far away. But it's the prime location is I looked on the map an hour and 5 minutes from my house. The they filmed part of it in Bastrop, which is about 40 minutes from my house. Um, yeah, it was kind of wild to realize. I'd always kind of heard growing up, oh yeah, they filmed part of Texas Chainsaw Massacre around the Round Rock, Greater Austin area, and was told completely the wrong locations. Someone would point at some haunted house off the side of I-35 when I was on the basketball team and say, that's where they filmed Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I was like, that can't possibly be correct. As we rolled by, and I was correct. Um, but yeah, it looks like the woods around our
Yeah,
houses growing up, which
yeah,
is unnerving in its own way.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when I was growing up, my folks and my dad's side of the family, they had a couple of houses in Oliver Peninsula.
Hmm.
And so driving out, 290, 71, whichever way we went that time, I mean, I never actually saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 first, and then didn't see this one till years later. So, I mean, I didn't see it in any sort of formative years. But yeah, I mean, you see these houses off this kind of old abandoned white houses off the side of the road that very much look like the old Franklin place that you're is a young kid, your mind kind of spins with like what's going on with this old abandoned house. There's got to be stories there. So seeing the movie, it feels very much like any trip that you or I probably could have been on when we were younger. So that locations really kind of helps kind of hit home on this one.
Yeah. The other thing that I had heard was that it was based on a true story, which is partially true. And I mean partially, partially. Did you dig into this at all?
No, no, I typically, I mean, the only thing that I'm aware of is Ed Gein sort of stuff, or however you say
Yeah.
that guy's last name.
Yeah.
But that's all I really know is like in the aspect of that guy being kind of the ground zero for lots of different, inspirations for, I guess, Hannibal
Yeah.
Lecter.
If you want to lose some sleep, I had always read that name. I'd seen it pop up, and it's Ed and Gein, I want to say. Gein,
And I
Gein.
think, yeah, and I think I'm mispronouncing it, but
I have no idea. But he was a gentleman, not gentleman. He was a human
no.
being who lived in Wisconsin in like the 40s and 50s. And he had, drinking problem, whatever, and he had a very strange relationship with his mother, and she passed. And eventually, near his house, there was a cemetery, and they started finding desecrated bodies. And one thing or another led them to go to Ed's house. I think the oh the someone disappeared who had been the cashier at a hardware store, and his transaction was the last one, the last receipt in the book. And so they went to his house and they found the person like missing her head and in the, basically hung up in the garage, like as if she were a deer. And then they went in the house, and I won't even get into what was in the house, but it was not good. And
No.
frankly, Texas Chainsaw Massacre references it really close and still isn't quite there. But I would suggest when you aren't going to go to sleep anytime soon, read the Wikipedia entry on this guy, because it did end up informing immediately. You can see how it ended up informing Psycho, Silence of the Lambs, and this movie. Because there's different aspects of what he did, this creative fellow,
Hmm.
that different they borrowed from Buffalo Bill for Silence of the Lambs, the whole mother aspect of Psycho, and then the decorating sense of the Leatherface family in this film. So I learned a whole lot Friday night right before I went to bed that I didn't want to know.
Yeah.
And that anyway, but yeah, do you what do you know about Toby Hooper or what Tobe yeah Tobe Hooper?
Well, I mean, I've seen some of his other stuff, but I tend not to. I mean, there's definitely directors that I like, but um, and there's some directors where I might go down kind of the rabbit hole of like, oh, now I want to see all of this person's work. But I tend to be more movie centric than director centric. So what is his other stuff? There's Strange Invaders. I know I've seen
Uh,
some.
Life Force is one big
Oh
one.
yeah. That's right. Life Force.
And in
Uh,
theory, he directed Poltergeist.
oh, that's right. That's right. I guess that's the big one where people like to get conspiratorial about who really directed it. It was Craig T.
Um,
Nelson, everybody.
he he was at UT Austin, where Justin and I are both alum. He also
Mm-hmm.
went through the film program, as we both did. And I think the strange thing to me now is he was 20 years. He did all this 20 years before we showed up at UT Austin, and the university absolutely does not claim him. Like there was not one reference to this guy in my 5 years in their Howard
Yeah.
halls.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know if I knew that he was a fellow Longhorn. So that's crazy that even in, those early mid 90s when we were there, that after this movie had gotten, I mean, it's well known as well. It's a renowned movie. It's certainly not, I don't think is seen as anything subpar. But yeah, how strange that that wasn't the selling point for the film program.
Well, in the film program, very much because you're coming off the Rodriguez. He'd just done El Mariachi, Desperado came out, and I
Yeah.
think it was sophomore year. And so there was this whole like DIY indie hero thing going on at UT Film at the time, and this is absolutely that. Like, and also
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
Letter, and from the late '80s and early '90s. Um, and we're not going to talk genre film though because we're in film school. So God forbid you create a wildly lucrative independent film. Um, don't do that, kids. Uh,
Yeah.
it was
And I would,
good.
oh, I was just going to say, and I would argue one that is incredibly well made, whether it is necessitated out of a shoestring budget, very artistic. I mean, there's some really interesting choices, both from a cinematography standpoint, editing standpoint. I mean, the sound design in this movie is fantastic. I mean, I tend to have to listen to it with headphones on, but even then, I mean, it's the whole soundscape of this thing is nothing but dread. And I've tried to find the soundtrack, and I don't think it exists. Maybe because, I mean, half of it is probably the sounds of old springs going off and things like that, and just more soundscape than score. But and that's another thing that I'm always struck with is how good looking this movie is. And I feel like if you were to drop this movie into release today, it would play in art houses, which I guess, probably don't really exist anymore. But I think this would be really latched onto by a more artistic crowd rather than, I mean, I've never seen a Saw movie, but what I imagine more to be kind of mainstream horror.
I don't disagree. I mean, it definitely has the indie vibe going for it. It definitely is more about tone than it is about anything to do with character or anything like that. I definitely noticed the soundscape and soundtrack. When I can't remember the character's name, but the second woman who lives is running through the woods, being chased by Leatherface. I was like, there hadn't been music in this movie in 10 minutes, at least, if
Yeah.
ever.
Yeah.
Like, that's when I kind of realized, like, this entire soundtrack is his freaking chainsaw and her screaming and breathing.
Mhm.
And it's
Yeah,
terrifying.
it is. And I'm always a little surprised that, and I don't know if this is just like a weird mix that I'm hearing, is that except for certain parts, I mean, the sound of the chainsaw is given, I guess, just as much level, it seems, as her voice.
Mhm.
So I keep expecting this movie to be nothing but screaming. And there is a lot of screaming in this movie. But that chainsaw, I mean, that sound really rises to the level of her screams, which, I mean, it kind of makes it, I mean, its own character in a way. I mean, it's just as important, I think, as her terror is just as important as the thing that's creating it. Or rather, I should
Yeah.
say, the thing that's creating it is just as important as her screams.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's so this is a quick flashback if it's you haven't don't remember what the actual plot is of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And there is one. Um a group of young adults who seem to be either summer breaking from college or just out of college have heard that a graveyard has been found with a bunch of desecrated human remains, and it's making the news. So they drive out there because they know that like their grandfather and other people are buried in this cemetery. It's actually the Baghdad Cemetery up in Leander that they filmed this at, which I remember from being a kid because Baghdad seemed like a very strange name for anything in Leander, Texas. Um, and I never heard about that connection. So anyway, yeah, there's a bunch of and so there's people kind of milling around, but the soundscape there similarly is the radio talking about all of this weird stuff happening kind of around the planet. It's almost like they borrowed from Night of the Living Dead of some of like the
Oh, yeah.
radio
Yeah.
broadcast. But it's somehow even more menacing because it's not like this is going to have a direct tie. It's just, hey, by the way, the world's insane and makes no sense. It is incredibly dangerous and unpredictable. So good luck out there.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's all right.
Yeah, one of my notes is all this radio broadcast is great. I mean, it is truly I mean, they set up this world gone mad. It's like the guy jumps out of the window because his sports show gets cut off, and there's like I mean, it's just such horror and terror, and it really sets. I mean, even if it really aids in this sense of dread, because the stuff they're talking about isn't just like, you know, it's all very weird, right? It's not just like, oh, somebody was shot in a daylight robbery sort of thing.
Right.
It's all like the 18-month-old baby was found in chained in the attic is like one of the things that they talk about, and just such bizarre, such kind of gloomy stuff that really gets in your ear and gets in your brain and really puts you on edge from the get-go. And then you have these shots of this like sunbursts and things like that, and it's the whole opening scene of this film is so unnerving and does such a really great job to really kind of throw you off your balance, I think.
Yeah,
Like, I
and
have
they
no
do the
idea.
thing that these movies tend to do, but I think it's borrowed largely from this is that's the audio landscape, and then you still have your like young adults who are not tuned, they're listening to it, but they're not listening to it. Like
Right,
it's
right.
just their background noise and they're still just passing a joint around while they're, having a good time in their microbus. Um, and that's been kind of played so often that now it kind of feels like a cliche and they play it up as if these people are idiots. and shouldn't they be paying attention, these stupid kids? And it's like, well, I think because it's just kind of this background noise, it has nothing to do with where they are, and they're already going out to go deal with, did Grandpa's body get desecrated? They're in a different headspace when they arrive. They don't ever treat these characters as idiots.
Right, right.
From there, they pick up a hitchhiker who, one of the people is in a wheelchair. Who's one of the people? There's five of them. There's three men and two women, and they're the girlfriends of the men. The men are the boyfriends of the women, and then the one of them's the brother of one of the girls, the guy in the wheelchair. And he's a little goofy, but he's also understandable and maybe the most human of the five characters, probably. But the hitchhiker they pick up kind of messes with him in the back and ends up pulling out a straight razor and cutting his arm with it before it's said and done. I won't get too much into the detail there, but they kick him out, end up at a gas station where they pick up some barbecue and realize there's no gas, but they still want to go see the old family homestead since they're out that direction. And the one of the couples takes off to go swimming and stumbles across, unfortunately, the Leatherface home over the hill, where they are quickly dispatched. But I won't get into the plot much further than that. But people make a lot of bad decisions about going to look for each other following that. So,
yeah, and they definitely don't feel like, and I don't know, maybe it's because I like this movie a lot, but they never really strike me as like dumb teenager types.
No.
Which I like. And I mean, talking about when they go to the old Franklin place, like that's another point where I just love this sound design. And it really kind of struck me this time is when, the two couples are upstairs goofing around and laughing, and Franklin's having to try to navigate this dilapidated house in his wheelchair. And they do this nice thing of when he's coming up, you can't really tell at first there's a lot of screaming and laughing. Mm-hmm. And it seems like it slowly dissolves between what sounds like screaming, and then he kind of slowly realizes they're just laughing. And for this movie, because we're still in bright sunny daylight, nothing bad has happened. Just again, these like little undertones of this dread, and that all these little shots like that zoom in on the daddy long legs. Like It just gets under your skin. I mean, this movie does so many things with, I think, just filmmaking ingenuity to not only things that are in the script, but I'm guessing things that Tobe Hooper thought of and saw. Like, I suspect you walk into this house and you see a hive of daddy long legs, and you immediately know this is a shot in our movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's get a 30-second burst of that so we can insert it somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then I didn't really realize, and I talked about some other movies I thought this one had impacted, but I would also argue it deeply impacted the Blair Witch. In its own way, because of the like little pagan things that are made out of bone and whatnot that are hanging around. And I wouldn't say like, oh, this is a witch movie, but obviously, but what the hell is going on? What are these? What's the word I'm looking for? It'll come to me at 3 a.m. tonight. But yeah, what are these little figures that are hanging up?
That's one of my notes was I wrote ritual and witchcraft. I mean, I don't think there's witchcraft going on here, but there's definitely this, by doing that, it gives it this kind of earthy, this like different level of earthy horror quality that's in it that, I mean, they're all very interesting. I mean, whoever was the bone wrangler and like whoever designed these things did a fantastic job. I mean, there's so much realized in the movie that that really works. That I don't you don't see it too much anymore because it feels like maybe things are rushed a little more. And I know this was probably a pretty short shoot. They couldn't have had very much money to make it, so I'm sure it was pretty rushed. But there's like all these little nuance things all throughout this movie that really make it feel more real, I guess, to me, and a lot of naturalistic stuff in here.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's kind of scary about this movie that's never going to be scary about like I mean, I like Freddy Krueger as much as the next guy, but Freddy Krueger ain't going to happen,
Right.
right? You're not going to suddenly be chased around by Freddy Krueger in your dream other than you're dreaming about Freddy Krueger, but you're not really going to get stabbed and die in your sleep, I assume. But this because of that earthiness, it really does feel like you were saying when you're driving, you know, across rural areas and you see those empty houses and you're like, what's going on over there? Why is that house still standing? What happened to the people who lived there? And then there's the more terrifying idea of what if there's still people in that house? Um, I do think that there's been kind of this trend in horror, and I don't think it's anything new. I think this is a very old part of horror, but you know, we've kind of gone from this is the people who are from a controlled suburban sort of environment going, you know, out of that back into the, and now we're doing a lot of movies about people who are like, you know, they're having their fancy yuppie dinner and suddenly, you know, there's the nighttime assassins show up outside the door who are, you know, going to terrorize them for the next 90 minutes or whatever.
Right. Right.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I also think it's plays to some very specific Americanisms
Mm-hmm.
of how we get paranoid and want to hunker down in our houses and you know whatever. This is a lot more of that question of what is going on in the rural, you know, kind of burnt out leftover part of America, and it's asking that in some ways. It's the entire thing happens because the meatpacking plant shut down, right?
Right. Right.
That's the connection we're given is, and there's a lot of stuff on that I'm always curious if younger people than us understand like how much people who are probably Tobe Hooper's age, and our age grew up in kind of the post 20th century boom era, and we're kind of living in the leftovers all of that. Or I don't think they feel that the same way. Everything's new and shiny and easily manufactured and disposable. But we were kind of growing up much more in the era of you knew that had been a working farm in the 1930s.
Right.
And that wasn't that long ago. That wasn't 100 years ago when we were kind of looking over the hill. So anyway, I did find it interesting that there was some, you know, even some commentary there of through the explanation of who these people were, and how they became so interested in meat.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just kind of more to the filmmaking. Like, I love when that first couple come onto the house and they go there because they're out of gas and they hear a generator running. And they're like, okay, well, maybe these folks are going to give us, maybe they'll, you know, maybe we can buy a couple of gallons of gas from these folks. And just the whole setup of the house with the generator and like, I love when they discover all the cars, presumably of people who have, you know, been killed, and how they never, I mean, it's easy to say like nowadays these movies, but there's no big music sting when they see this. There's no like, it's just like an offhanded, like, oh, hey, look at all these old cars. And it having seen it a number of times, I don't know how it was the first time, but it just really helps build this like foreboding of something bad is going to happen. Like, I don't necessarily know if, I mean, if I were in their shoes and I saw all these cars, I just might think, okay, well, when you pass by these houses, sometimes you'll see like an old rusted out pickup truck or something like that sitting out there. You don't think twice about it. You just think, okay, well, it'll probably stop working.
Yeah.
And they just left it there and bought a new pickup. And there's all, I mean, the movie feels really, the story feels really lived in rather than being put there just to make a point for the movie you're watching.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And the characters don't know they're in a movie called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like, I know when I'm watching this movie, if I see a whole bunch of empty cars, that clearly, I know all I knew at this point in the movie was there was a guy named Leatherface who was going to pop up with a chainsaw in the near future. I knew he wasn't driving all of those cars.
no.
That was as much as I knew. But yeah, so I was like, oh man, that's pretty smart when I saw that.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, they're just a movie called Tiny Red Short Shorts. I think that's the the name of the film they exist in.
Right.
Which is funny because I think almost all of like I've seen all the Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies. I think maybe about this time or so, within the past year or two, I just went on a binge of watching them all. I think in release order. I think I have a letterbox list of like all my thoughts and rankings and things. But I think all but one movie repeats that shot, like the under the chair swing following. So I don't know. I thought it's very clever that clearly everybody who came after this movie is like, all right, this is a pretty good shot. let's let's get that in here.
They're back at it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I guess maybe before we get into the chainsaw-ness of this movie, I also really like the script in this movie. I think I think it's very funny. I think there's a lot of very funny lines in it. Like I like when the first couple comes down to the creek that's dried up, and the girl says something about, or I think the boyfriend says, "I wonder how Franklin got down here." She says, "Oh, I bet somebody carried him when he was little," and his response is just, "Franklin was never little." like, like yeah, Franklin probably was never little. I like Franklin's line about after they pick up the hitchhiker, when the hitchhiker says, "Oh, you can drop me off at my house. I live real close to here. You can meet my family." And his response is, "Oh, a whole family full of Draculas." I mean, just there's some really funny lines in this. And so Kim Hinkle, who wrote it, I think he wrote and directed the Matthew McConaughey, Renee Zellweger, Texas Chainsaw. That movie is weird. I really like it, but it's a real. It's got that same sense of humor. Like if you take those little like weird kind of funny bits of this movie, that is almost the entire movie of that one. So I know it got easily dismissed when it came out because it got came out, showed at South by Southwest, and then sat on a shelf for several years. But it's well worth seeing, especially if you want to complete your Texas Chainsaw.
I thought about it yesterday because that's what it wanted me to roll over to directly from this when I was watching this it's on Peacock if you're looking for it. I mean, I know I'm like the one guy out in the wilderness going, get Peacock. But they have a lot of good movies, especially horror movies. And as you're heading, through the Halloween season, it's well worth having. But it rolled over and it was like babyface McConaughey, in the shot that they're like, roll over to watch this one next. It's like, man, I really should just to see like baby McConaughey and baby Zellweger. And I remember seeing the trailer for it, I think with you at the Dobie, and that was the only time I ever saw any acknowledgement of that movie existing other than like a bad review in the Chronicle.
Sure. Yeah. but I mean, I would say some evening, give it a whirl. It's weirder and more interesting than one might think.
I believe it, believe it, and it's free on Peacock to make it even better.
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, so yeah, the house itself is interesting that they filmed in. And one of the things you can tell that this is a low budget movie with is um and I noticed this first as they were doing kind of the shot of the cars and there's the generator going. I was like, if this movie weren't completely no budget, that generator would be all rusted out and they would intentionally make it look like an old. And I was like, this is clearly just a generator they had on the set that is brand new.
Yeah.
And the house itself, when they do wide shots, you're like, this house is in really good shape, aside from all the
Well,
stuff hanging around.
yeah, and I mean, so it makes sense why. So Drayton Sawyer is my favorite character. The I guess he's supposed to be the oldest brother. I think in some versions of the movie, he's the dad. This guy is hilarious. I was going to say this is why clearly he's so upset when Leatherface chops open the door to try to get to Sally. I mean, and again, talking about that script, the family dynamics in this movie are really funny. And I
Yeah.
think they're funny on, and I think they're funny on purpose, especially having seen the McConaughey Zellweger version, which is just filled with silly stuff. Um, I mean, I think one of my notes is I would watch the Sawyer family sitcom where they're just trying, like, this could be like the new kind of blue collar Roseanne sort of show to bring, people together, is just these poor guys trying to run the gas station and make barbecue. And you got the I don't know, just the, like, what is he, just all the things he calls the hitchhiker brother, like throughout this whole thing, like half-wit and coon shit and all this, all these like silly names that it could have been in the script or could have just been made up on the spot. But I love the family dynamics, and that's really something that kind of keeps me coming back to these movies, is just that silly repartee with this family.
So the two first couple gets dispatched and it's really impressive how well they handle that in the film. I want to call that out.
Yeah.
The first guy gets hit over the head with a sledgehammer, and it's like 2 seconds. It's not the second you see Leatherface, a hammer is coming down, and the first guy, whose name I can't remember, it doesn't matter, is dead.
Yeah.
And then his girlfriend wants to know why he's not making any noise from the house, and goes in and gets hung up on a meat hook and is about to get drained. And you never really see it. That was my concern, of course, with this movie all these years.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
like in a quote unquote slasher movie, I'm never usually interested because I have no interest in watching knives pierce flesh over and over for 90 minutes. Just not my thing. So that doesn't happen here. It's too low budget, and they understood what the horror of it was. As much as bad as it was for her to get impaled on a meat hook, which is about as bad as it gets, she's about to get drained. She knows exactly what's about to happen here. And then the next guy who goes in, opens the freezer, and her popping out is just, oh my God, just unbelievable.
Oh yeah, and it's like, it feels like something out of a neighborhood haunted house almost.
Mhm.
That I just love. I mean, it's very effective. It's very strange. Um, it's got a good, I think, like little sound sting that goes with, because he opens it and she looks like she's dead, then she pops up, and what a good scene.
And it's a movie that has its jump scares, and that's certainly one of them. But I think most other movies, it would have been enough for the guy just to have seen her just playing there, or maybe in the late '80s, early '90s, she would have been like, "Yeah, or something,"
Right.
Um, but I think it the mood of this movie that worked better. Um, for whatever reason, as you get impressed randomly with things as you're watching a movie, I was like, yeah, that was a really good. Um, but
Yeah.
the then pushing the guy in the wheelchair toward they get stuck in the problem of the van doesn't have keys in it. Somebody, whoever, the people who've gone missing have the keys, and now they're basically trapped with the van at the other house. The two people who are remaining and have to go to the other house. But to your point, once the wheelchair guy gets the chainsaw, um, her waking up the family, and that's been ripped off since, I think, a multitude of times.
Mhm.
But her waking up to that family, like having their crazy ass dinner in front of her, and they've set a plate for her. It's the best
Yeah.
part. There's a
They-
sausage link and like sides waiting for
I know. Oh, yeah. And I did. So I got some barbecue before this, and I had meant to be talking like Franklin, like has that little piece of sausage that he's like kind of chewing on like a cigar and like pointing at. And I love that when he's eating that sausage, and of course we all know what the sausage is. Again, just the stuff they do and do not point out is I love him eating the sausage, and he kind of looks at it at first, and he's like spitting out little pieces, and we've all gotten sausage that has little pieces of bone or gristle or something like that. But I mean, knowing exactly what he's spitting out is just so nice. And there's no close up of the sausage.
her.
There's no like him putting two and two together. They just make no mention of it. It's so great. I just love it.
Well, even when they go in to go buy the sausage and they think it's just a gas station at the beginning, and he comes out with this huge bag of barbecue that's like greasy and dripping through the bag. And then you figure out what's been going on. And I was just like, oh my God. Because they ate it in the
Yeah.
car.
Mm-hmm.
Just, yeah, like you said, it doesn't ever call attention to itself. It's just there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
And before, so when we're down to Sally and her brother Franklin, I just love that interaction with them arguing over the flashlight, and how no character. I don't think any of the characters ever says, I'm really scared right now. It's just this great natural expression of how somebody who is terrified would act without having to say, I'm terrified. Just like these stupid little arguments that they keep making. And I mean, he knows that he can't get from point A to point B because he's in this wheelchair, but just his insistence of, okay, then fine, I'll go with you. Okay, I'll go with you. And the whole time she's like, Franklin, you have to stay here. I cannot take you. Just, I mean, it again, I think really goes to Kim Hinkle's writing that it's so naturalistic, and there's not a whole lot of movie dialogue, movie acting, and whether that's because they had a limited amount of film and they just had to hopefully get it the first time and just took the most naturalistic first take, or what, but it really amps up the terror in that they feel like how real people would act versus how a character would act in order to make the next scene effective.
right. Yeah. And it also, I mean, it does make the next scene effective in that he's got to go with her. I mean, there's not another option, and as an audience, we know, this is an insanely bad idea. I knew someone made it out at the end because I'd seen the last 20 seconds or whatever of the film. It tends to get called to as this, great moment in horror cinema, or it's whatever the one shot people feel comfortable showing, in kind of, whatever montages, but um, yeah, she in knowing what the Texas Hill Country terrain is like, and just imagining pushing this guy who had to been 230 pounds, 240 pounds, like cross that. You even see like some white rock and some cactus as she's going by, and I'm just like dying inside, knowing that even that actress had to push that guy for the shots.
No.
Oh,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, no, I mean it. I think that they do a really good job of set decorating the house, of the lead up to finding the grandparents up in the attic. And I did not realize the grandfather was supposed to still be alive. I thought that was a mask like propped up on a dummy until they brought him back downstairs for that sequence. I was like, oh my God, it's moving. They actually did the makeup and all that for this. Um, but yeah, it's kind of brilliant, and of course the joke of the armchair. Uh, they've stapled someone's arms to a chair to replace the.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's
Um,
that's the kind of like okay, they know they're winking at the audience from time to time with this, with like how totally gross this is. So,
yeah, yeah. And again, it's just the humor in this movie really always makes, and that's kind of part of the, you think it's a blood and guts sort of, we're going to see 90 minutes of people getting chopped up, and you
yeah,
don't. And you have characters. I mean, and I love, I mean, the whole Sawyer family, they all have their weird little quirks and personalities, and they're not just a personification of like a bad, decrepit person. I love how Drayton, he can't, like, he has this big speech about like, I can't kill people. Like,
yeah.
I can't do it. Like, I'll be the cook. I can't do it. But at the same time, and I think the worst part of this movie is the drive from the gas station to the house, where she goes, the scene where she escapes Leatherface and she goes to the gas station and she runs into him. And I can't really remember if at this point, I don't think at this point we know that he's part of the family.
We don't. Well, we can probably guess because of the blood stain on the side of the van, of like they've marked
Mm-hmm.
the van. But we don't really know what it means, and it seems like maybe he's not affiliated in the same way as the actual owner of the station. But yeah, it's definitely a false sense of security, and their indication of what's going on is when she's kind of staring at the barbecue hanging up while he's left her alone in there. Um, but there's
Yeah, and
also
that,
nothing to indicate those are humans that are hanging up in there.
right.
They're just kind of these indistinct pieces of meat hanging up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, the shot where he goes, like she says, we got to call somebody. He's like, well, we don't have a phone here. I'll go outside. I'll look around. And just that shot of like her kind of in the corner of the frame, you have that empty door. It's spooky. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's good, like legitimate spooky stuff, because you don't know. I'm sure seeing it for the first time, if you don't know or don't suspect that he's part of the family, you think he's going to get killed, or Leatherface is just going to run in there.
Yeah, and that
Um,
absolutely that's what it feels like because she's just been running from Leatherface
mhm.
and he's an idiot and leaves the door open is what it feels like. Yeah.
Right, right. But he's really good with a broom. Like he, but kind of going back, I think the hardest to watch part of all of this is that pickup ride from the gas station to the house, where he's just poking her with a stick, and clearly you see like they're all not good people, but
Yeah.
you see that, I mean, maybe he can't kill people, but he sure gets off on people in pain.
Yeah.
And it, to me, that's kind of that's the toughest to watch scene in the whole thing, because it just feels of a movie that feels very possible to happen. That scene to me is like the most possible of just somebody being violent to a person because they have the opportunity to do it.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of maybe the summation of a lot of these, you know, take a person you relate to and drop them in the wilderness, and now they're going to be, you know, in this case they're going into the wilderness, and other times it's like, well, they're in their Airbnb cabin and, you know, having a family dinner and the people are coming in from outside. You know, just the idea of invaders are scary, but it's the casual malevolence that I think we're really scared of.
Yeah.
It's scary enough to have someone who you think is completely unhinged, like a guy wearing human flesh over his face and running around with a hammer and chainsaw. But it's another thing to have someone who's actually devious about it, and is going to enjoy inflicting all of that on you. And that's why I found that irony of the whole, like, oh, I just can't take a life. I'm like, that's a strange line you've picked, my friend.
Right.
So,
He's just a cook. And I love that, like, I think in this movie, they're all supposed to be brothers, which is kind of weird because they call grandpa grandpa, but there's no real father in the whole thing. And maybe they're all supposed to be
I thought he was
inbred
supposed to be the dad when I was watching it because he kept saying, your brother did this, or your brother did, like, look at what you did to your brother.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in my head, he's the dad of the family. Um, I'm going to try to find. Have you ever seen the Ransom Center, which is maybe the greatest museum in Austin? They have the original Leatherface mask in their
Oh,
collection,
I
and
did
let me
not
try
know
to
that.
find a picture of it.
This, you know, this is an audio podcast.
I know it's an audio podcast, but I think that. All right, so tell me who this looks like. I mean, it looks exactly like Donald Trump, doesn't it?
Well, that's weird.
Isn't that weird? So I guess that's yes, I realize this is an audio podcast. There's an even better one if I'm looking at that right there.
Oh yeah, that one in particular. Yeah, that must be the inside.
Yeah. So anyway, listeners, you should really look up the original Leatherface mask at the Ransom Center. It's a trip to
We
see
will
what
link
it looks
to
like.
it in on the blog and here on the SoundCloud.
Yeah. Um, I like the little bit where he has her in the car before this like terror ride back to the house, and he leaves the door open. He's like, "Oh, wait, got to go back," and he shuts off the lights. And it's just like, the cost of electricity these days, it's like enough to put a man out of business. And again, it's these little lines that, I mean, it's a funny line, but it also kind of illuminates like these people are just like left with nothing. I mean, like you said earlier, the plant's closed down. Everybody's been laid off because of technology, essentially,
Mhm.
and it gives these people not a justifiable backstory, but it gives them kind of an interesting backstory again that they don't say like, they don't make huge points about like, oh, we've had to resort to cannibalism and this is how we have to get our beat nowadays.
Yeah, I mean they're clearly enjoying their work at this point, but yeah, I mean they've gotten good at it. They've got their system down. They've started a car collection on the side. But yeah, I mean the decoration of the house. It's this. The funny thing is that house still exists. It's now like a casual burger joint in Kingsland, Texas, which is an hour from my house. Which I'd never actually heard of Kingsland, Texas. I guess it's something like way up the river from the lake. But yeah, it's still there, and they acknowledge that it's part of the movie in some of the promotional materials, but it's this cute, quaint little, country house at this point, that you can go get a $13 hamburger and fries. And now I kind of want to drive up there just to like, that's a crazy thing that for this to have ended up as. But I'm sure the people when they bought it were like, okay, we're aware of the history, and then realized actually it's a bit of a draw.
Yeah.
And I think they have like a Halloween mask of Leatherface or something like behind the counter, and that's pretty much their only acknowledgement of what it is. But when you see the exterior of it, it's still white. They haven't changed it. Um, the it's a two-story kind of, just kind of standard farmhouse. But like I said, it is funny to me that like the woodwork in the house was like immaculate from everything else. So you're absolutely right. And I noticed when he was sawing through the door, I was like, I wonder why that door looks so janky when the rest of the house looks so good. And then the saw went through it, and I was like, oh, because they built that door for the shot. That's why.
Look what your
Okay.
brother did to the door. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, maybe the movie ends very abruptly, and it ends with a number of questions, right? I mean, the final girl, she's gotten away, we assume, driving away in the back of a truck with probably Tobe Hooper driving it. I have no idea who's actually driving that truck. It's unimportant. But she's tried to make good her escape in part by employing this like semi truck driver who's driving a cattle car. And that guy is not running anywhere fast.
No, the Black Maria. No.
Yeah. But he has to pass Leatherface to get back to his truck. And I was like, well, what happens now to this guy? Like,
I hope he makes it out. I think he makes it out. I mean, Leatherface has a chopped up leg
yeah,
because fallen down. He's taken a wrench to the head.
yeah.
So I
He's
choose.
lost a relative. He's having a bad day. Yeah.
He really is. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. uh, the Dracula #1 gets run over. I choose to believe that this Good Samaritan lives.
Yeah. So I'm curious so it now is kind of this classic final shot of Leatherface swinging a running fully going chainsaw just around like a drunk maniac. Apparently the actor hadn't slept because they'd been shooting all night, and he'd been up for like 24 hours at this point and was just kind of out of his mind. I'm sure there were some substances involved as well. Um, but it's a really the frustration of the character, which you don't ever leave Jason with or Freddy with or any of these other characters with. And not even Michael Myers, really, when I think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Michael always pops up at the end, and but yeah, I found it a really good ending, and I think maybe ending it on a big question mark of so what now is a really interesting ending. Both with the guy not making it back to his truck quite. What's she gonna do? What you go get the cops, I guess. But it's satisfying, but also as open-ended as I think a lot of the rest of the film is, of not really filling in the blanks or giving you too much comfort. So
Yeah, talking about I guess the cultural impact of that shot. Sydney was watching some cartoon the other day, and it involved, I guess, the characters getting lost in the woods. In the last shot of her cartoon was a woman in the back of a green pickup truck just laugh screaming, and then it goes to credits. And I'm like, okay, Sydney, do you know where that comes from? She's like, is it one of your movies? I'm like, yeah, it's one of my movies.
one of Daddy's movies. People get hung on meat hooks.
Yeah, but it's yeah, I mean, in her apparently the filming was not easy on Marilyn Burns, but her performance is fantastic. In the her laugh scream as she's driving away is, I mean, it's chilling. It's
Yeah.
very effective, and it leaves you with as much unease as the rest of the movie, which is a pretty solid way to end your horror movie.
Yeah, she's not going to be okay after this.
No,
It's
no.
not like, hey, in the sequel, you find Marilyn Burns is now like writing books and like just living quietly in, Temple, Texas or something. Um,
Yeah.
so I
So
haven't seen the sequels, but you have seen the sequels.
I've seen every last one of them. Um, and they are okay to varying degrees. Um, uh, the 2000s, I think it's 2000s ones, they very much play like what you think the movie's supposed to be. Or
Uh-huh.
if somebody described it poorly as like, oh, it's about the guy with the chainsaw that kills people to turn them into barbecue. That's the later movie. I mean, that's most of the remakes,
Yeah.
or that's at least after. I guess what maybe three is the last like real one. I mean, two is a hoot.
Okay.
Two is very
That's I've
funny.
heard that one is, yeah, like there's a whole family and
Yeah, and it's especially. I mean, Dennis Hopper's hilarious in it. Um, it's good. It takes place right around Texas OU um, game. That's the
oh my
start of the
God.
movie. So we're getting into a really good time to watch it. Um, it's very, I mean, it's silly, but it's not so. There's enough silly seeds, I think, in this one to make it to where when you see the next one, you're like, okay, well, it's kind of like a bit of an alternate universe of these characters, but it's not so wildly outside of where the first one started. And then three, I think, is called just Leatherface, and it's got some really silly stuff in it, but in a different direction. And then I guess after that, it kind of disappears for a while, and then you get these, what is it, Platinum Dunes or whatever? Is that Michael Bay's?
I
You
I
know,
I all I
yeah,
remember is Leatherface goes Hawaiian. Leatherface goes west.
that's a pretty
Leatherface
good
goes bananas.
one. Road to uh,
Road to Bastrop.
Road to Bastrop is perfect. Um, the I will say I really like the latest one that found its way to Netflix. That I think Paul knows the guy who directed it. Um, it just hit me right. It feels of all the sequels or sidequels or whatever you want to call them. Um, it's pretty. I really liked it. It's got a lot of good Austin was cooler before you got here vibes about it, which are pretty funny. I mean,
Okay.
I laughed a lot at it because the director I think has clearly seen Austin change,
Yeah.
and it has some nice poking fun at Teslas, all this sort of thing. Um, they do this movie does its version of the last shot, and it is perfect. It is like the next best thing to the original last shot. So if nothing else, I highly recommend it for the last shot. It's a good, really good last shot. Um, yeah, I kind of wish I would have seen the 3D one because it's one of the worst movies I've ever seen in the theater because it makes no sense. It's wildly derivative. But the Netflix one kind of, if I remember right, I think Sally is a character
Oh, okay.
in it. I think it's older Sally is in it. Um, I was trying to look up to see if that is indeed the character. Yeah, Yeah. So
Um, so in kind of your movie pantheon of Texas Chainsaw movies, we just covered that, of horror
mhm.
film, where does this really sit with you?
This is easily my stock answer's favorite horror film.
Okay.
It's not the scariest horror film I've ever seen. It's, you know, maybe not the most interesting, but I it works for me on so many levels. Like I think it's very beautiful to look at. Daniel Pearl's cinematography is gorgeous, and I think he does some of the later ones. And clearly, the guy knows what he's doing. I mean, this wasn't a one off for this guy. Uh, I like the acting. I like Texas. I like armadillos. I
Yeah.
like Shiner. I like BarBQ. I like pickup trucks too. Um, so, as a native to Central Texas, there's a certain draw also that makes me easily put this as like, hey, Justin, what's your favorite horror film? The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah, I mean, this is going to definitely be put up pretty high with me. I've one of the things I've enjoyed about doing the podcast every Halloween is kind of getting exposed to various horror things I normally wouldn't do. I was always like it's 1930 to 1940 Universal or get the hell out like time
Mm-hmm.
guy. And then, going through the Hammer stuff, I totally like bought into that hook, line, and sinker. Like, love the Hammer stuff. And I like getting pushed to go check out this stuff that I kind of wrote off and was like, well, if I go to my grave without ever seeing, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I'm totally fine. And I think I would have missed out. Like, it's hard to say, like, yes, the innate cultural value of watching, a bunch of young people run away from a person with a hammer and chainsaw is, I learned a lot about myself from watching this movie or anything. But um, to see something this well executed and to understand the ripple effects it had across not just the indie horror scene, that was kind of, you get this and then and you get this, you get the hills that have eyes, and then you get, just thing after thing of, you can kind of point back to this as, even all the Friday the 13th stuff, you've essentially got a killer with a mask and whatever. He doesn't have a specific weapon he uses. He's got a specific look. I mean, you can't say
Mm-hmm.
Leatherface doesn't have like, how did they come up with like that? Like, hey, you're going to be a guy who looks like maybe he overeats and you're wearing a suit badly, and carry a chainsaw, and you're going to be wearing, a human's face across your face. Um, I have no idea why he's wearing a suit. I never. It doesn't matter. I guess he's dressed for the occasion. He dresses for dinner. Good for him. Um, but it's it's amazing to see how much impact this thing clearly had.
Yeah.
And it's so different from Psycho, even though both of them kind of do the same thing in their own way of
Mm-hmm.
like luring these people in to a place where they can be victimized. Um, and the taking on the other personas and all that kind of stuff that comes from the Ed Gein stuff. Um, but to see kind of where everything kind of went from this is absolutely fascinating. But in understanding, maybe also this is where some of the humor stuff came from, instead of it being unintentional camp humor. Of any point to any black and white 1950s horror film for the most part, and the radioactive iguana or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember the name of that one, but it's baller. But to see this kind of thing where they know, and right to one of our mutual favorites from back in the day, the Evil Dead movies, and kind of what came around then of them bringing their sense of humor to horror, which would have been 3 years later, something like that.
Yeah.
um and just knowing that it was possible, and all these guys were like, you need your hook, and you if you can convince a bunch of young people to be abused in the woods somewhere for 6 weeks, you're golden. And apparently that was very easy to do back in the 70s. But
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it really helps that it's, um, I mean, to quote that guy, it's a real movie. It's a real movie. And I think that helps. It's not, I mean, I've not seen The Hills Have Eyes, but I don't know if that is a movie that does anything other than simply drop people into terrifying situations and let the terrifying situation play out. Versus, I think something like this that has a lot more. Clearly, I'm speculating on that movie, but there's more tone, there's more character in this movie than there ever needs to be, which I like a lot.
Yeah,
and I think that's, at least for me, is what keeps its staying power, other than the pure icon that is Leatherface in a suit with his human face mask and his chainsaw.
Yeah. I would definitely say go check out The Hills Have Eyes. I think it's just very well executed for what it does, okay. But I don't think you're necessarily wrong in your guess on that. And that's not to diss a Wes Craven movie in any way, shape, or form. It's just, I do think there's some humor to it, but I was surprised watching this, like, oh my God, there is an absolute direct line to this. But people talk about the setup for The Hills Have Eyes. They don't talk about it with Texas Chainsaw Massacre in necessarily the same way. So, anyway, well, thank you so much for getting me to finally watch this. I'm not sure I'm going to make it through the other 20 Texas Chainsaw Massacre movies this year, but I might check out the Zellweger one and the 2022 one. I don't know. I'm now very curious about it. You never know with these things. I tried to watch a bit of the Rob Zombie Halloween movie, and I was not the guy for that movie. I was not. And I never know with remakes and people wanting to put their own spin on these things how it's going to go. But of course, I really liked the new Halloween movies.
Me too. Yeah, me too. That last one I thought was really fantastic.
So yeah, I mean, I'll give the 2022 one a spin, and if you've never seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre and somehow made it to the end of this podcast and haven't guessed that it has my ringing endorsement, Peacock is like $6 or something a month. It's really cheap. It's great to have at least over kind of the spooky season. So,
for sure, lots of good stuff there.
Any final thoughts, sir?
No, I don't think so. I think I've covered it all.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll bring you back in short order. I think we're going to start having to worry about Christmas already. So start jingling all the way or whatever you're going to do, and but we'll be back soon with more Justin here on the Signal Watch podcast. And do you want people to find you on social media or not?
I think the only place where I'm remotely interesting is probably Letterboxd, which I think you might still have the little thing on the side.
If you go to signal-watch.com and you look on the left-hand menu bar, you can find Justin's Letterboxd. So, which I check out regularly. So, all right, man. Well, happy Halloween.
Yeah, you too. Happy Halloween, everybody.
That about wraps it up for this edition of The Signal Watch, a production of the League of Melbotus. Thanks for sticking with us. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to drop on by the Signal Watch blog, where you'll find write-ups of a wide variety of movies and more. We'd love to hear from you, so find us online and let us know what you think. Whether you prefer email, blog comments, or social media, we'll be happy to hear from you. We'll be back soon with more exceedingly high-quality content. So, until next time, God damn it, babies, you've got to be kind.